Nate, are we good to go?
Yep, good to go.
Okay. All right, guys. Welcome FSW CS whatever, whichever prefix you'd like. 13. Today we're going to be talking about class components. So um, so far uh, we've talked about functional components and how we can compose a web application um, with components. And yesterday we went into a little bit how to make those reusable and got into some really cool stuff yesterday to be able to make one component that can be shared and used in different parts of our application, and using props uh, to make it reusable depending on the context of where it's placed in our code. So we're going to look real quick at what you learned a few weeks ago with classes. Let's see, classes are right here. So I want you to use your memory brain power to jump back in time with me. If we could get that time turner from whoever had that yesterday, maybe that would work for us. So when you learned classes, this is what we talked about. You can create a function that has the this keyword, and you're passing in an object to this person function, and then you're assigning the different properties of this object to the object that's going to be returned to this object here inside this function. And then we can use these properties on this keyword inside a prototype function, inside a function that's built onto the prototype of this object. So you remember this, and we said, okay, this is how JavaScript traditionally has handled these kind of situations. Then classes were introduced into the JavaScript world, and instead of writing this code and putting a bunch of things on the prototype of a class or of this constructor function, we use classes now, and everything looks a lot better. So instead of putting speak on the prototype, we now have speak available as a property on this person class. So we move things out of the prototype and put them on properties. You remember the constructor function inside a class that takes care of all this stuff here. And then beyond that, so we can create a class. Beyond that, we can extend these classes. So if we have a parent or a person class up here, and then we make a child class, we can extend that class that we've written. So this is person, we're extending parent. So we can extend other classes when we create a new class, and we get access to the properties of that base class here. So looking at this syntax, this is really important because we're going to be using this a lot in React. So we've got a base class here that we're extending when we're creating a new class. And we have, if we call super, we get access to what is on that parent class. And then, for example, in this situation, we have isChild on the parent class that we can now access within our constructor and we have children attributes dot isChild. So isChild is coming from the parent, because we supered it up right here. Then we can set that to this class using the this keyword. So you'll get really used to this syntax because we use this to create class components inside our JavaScript. So I'm going to open up a code box here, or excuse me, sandbox, code sandbox. Combine the two, and let's take a look at what how we can do this in a React application. All right, so looking at our application here, we've got this class, the app class, that's being rendered to the DOM. There we go. So let's take this component and we're going to turn this into a class component. So right now, let's not worry about our return. We're just going to focus on this section right here. So the first thing we're going to do is, just like we saw in here, we're going to create a class and we're going to extend a base class that we get from React. So we're going to create a class here and we're going to call it app so that it can be rendered here. And then this app class, this class component is going to extend a class that we get from React that we're importing right here. So we're going to call react.component. And this extends, this is the, this is going to be the syntax that we see all over inside React. So Clint asks if we can explain super again. Yeah, absolutely. So if we're looking at this, just as this function up here is taking in, when we invoke this function, we pass it an object, and within this function we're calling that object attributes, and then we have access to the different properties on the attributes function or attributes object inside our person function. So when we turn this into a class, we still need to be able to do this kind of setup where we are taking this attributes object and putting it onto using the this keyword to create, in this sense, we're kind of creating a properties for this function. So this function now has a gender property, an age property, a name property, and a hometown property. And we're getting the value for those from this object here. So we move down into a class, and this happens by inside the constructor now. So we have our constructor function that receives that same attributes object and does the exact same thing, just attaches these properties to this class. And then when you instantiate a new object with this class, in other words, when you say new person and then call it with an object, then it's going to do the same thing that's happening up here when you called this function. So it receives an object and it adds the properties from that object to the class itself. So these are now properties on the class. But when we're outside of the constructor, we can also create our own properties like this. So we can do anywhere inside our code now, we can do person.gender, and we get the gender. We can do person.name, and we can do person.speak. And when we invoke person.speak, it will call this here. It'll return this text here. Okay, so that's classes. Now, when we get into extending a base class in our new class, the reason that we even want to extend a base class is we want all the functionality that's already built into the parent class, and we want a little bit more. So we do this pattern to only write the functionality of parent once, and then we extend that base component with our new component and add a little bit more functionality inside child. So parent can't do anything with check if child here, but child can access the properties on the parent class. And the way that we do that is inside the constructor we call super. So super gives us the ability to access what's inside the parent component. So this is a little bit of weird setup if you're used to like C++ or Java or something like that that actually has real classes. Classes in JavaScript are just objects like everything else in JavaScript. So we have to do a little bit more setup than those other languages. Maybe they do have super, I don't remember exactly. So we call super and we get access to things that are on the parent class. So in that sense, we have. Thank you, Tom. That's a good way to put it. So calling super here calls the constructor from the parent class. So if this was our parent class, if person was our parent class, and we pass in our child attributes, then child attributes would be passed here, and then we'd get all these properties set to the attributes, and we'd have access to this.gender, this.age from inside this child class. Okay, so let's look at what that means in React. So just like what we saw there, we're going to have a constructor. Right now, it's not going to, we're not going to pass anything into it. Oh, good question. So where does the dot component come from? So React is an object that we are importing from the React project file down here in our dependencies. So we get React. This is a fancy way of getting this CDN project files. So, oops. So we're importing an object called React from the React files. And then on that object, there is a component, class component called component. So we're really just extending a base component from React. Okay, so inside our constructor, we're going to call super. And this is going to do a couple things for us, which we're going to get to in just a minute. Before we get to there, let's look at how we. This is going to be important to talk about right now. So when we call super, we get a few things from this base component, and mainly what those things are they're called component lifecycle hooks. So the React component base class allows us to use some methods from this base component, and that the React team has built and curated for us to tap into, and those methods are called the component lifecycle hooks. These lifecycle hooks give us control in how a component works. We'll get into into a few more in Monday's lesson, which will come in on Friday afternoon. But there's one really important one that we need to talk about. So calling super lets us access life cycle methods, or hooks, as you'll see them referred to. And one that needs to happen in all of our class components is called render. And it's pretty easy to kind of reason about what's happening, but the render lifecycle hook is going to let us return some JSX that will get rendered to the DOM. So let's return, and we'll, this is very familiar from our functional components. So we'll just return a header that says, hello, class, world. If that even makes sense. Don't know if that makes sense. Da, da, da. And there we go. So a little bit more setup, and we've got this new lifecycle hook method that we have to run in order to return our JSX. But this should be familiar enough to us now that we can understand at least this part right here. So Linda asked, what is a lifecycle method? Yeah, let's look at React lifecycle methods. Before I do that, when you hear the word lifecycle, what does that mean to you? What comes to your mind when you hear the word lifecycle? Thanks, Brian, for the magic. Is that a potato? Something. So give me some answers. What do you hear? Oh, cool. There we go. I just needed to give you time to type. Awesome. So life cycle is a process. Casey says birth to death. Perfect. The time that the object is alive. Yeah. So we've got this idea that these components have a life. They have a start, a middle, an end. They have a birth, a death. They have some time in existence. And just like in The Lion King, there is the circle of life. Cool. So yes, beautiful, love it. So just like the name suggests, each component that we write in our React apps are going to have kind of this birth, this lifetime, and a death. Yeah, actually, it's really funny because the example we're going into today is Disney characters, so it fits. Except I didn't write out Simba. We'll add Simba in there. Okay, so let's look at what this means. This is kind of the go-to image for talking about React lifecycles. This was put together by Dan Abramov, who is on the React core team. So let's take a look at this, and don't worry if we're just going to go through this quickly because we don't need to know very much about this right now. So there's kind of three parts of a component's life. The birth, quote unquote, birth phase is mounting, this mounting column here. And then while that component is alive somewhere in our app, we've got this kind of life phase where it can be updated and changed, and React is updating the DOM, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the component dies, it goes through this unmounting phase. Now, each little box inside this diagram, each of these are lifecycle methods, okay? Perfect, thank you, Vera. So our constructor is a lifecycle method, and our constructor gets called only during the mounting phase. So when we're looking at this and I hit refresh, then our component, while it's blank right there, our component is mounting. It's in this mounting process. It's in this birthing process. Don't worry, Patrick. This is we're going to cover this a lot more later, but I want you guys to see kind of this important render part right here. So when we first open our component, it's going to mount, and our constructor gets called, and our render gets called. And then while it's alive, we can call, render can be called again, depending on a couple things that can happen. So we can trigger this render function again during the life of our component. And then finally, when we route away from our component, when we go to another page in our website, that component will die and will no longer be alive inside our DOM. Okay, so I want you to think about these lifecycle methods as the life that your component has in the browser. So if it's displaying something, if it's being rendered to the DOM, then it is in this life cycle. Okay, now going back to this, what I want you to take from that is, first of all, don't get overwhelmed, because you will understand a lot of this in coming days. I don't want you to understand everything that you saw in that diagram today, but I do want you to know what life cycle means, and that there are different functions, different methods that get called during different phases of a component's life cycle. And the way that we get access to those methods and can run some logic in those methods is by calling super. Okay, so that's the whole point of that exercise, was to look at what super gives us in the form of lifecycle methods. So coming back down to simpleness and to blissfulness and happiness, we have this render function that is a lifecycle hook that we get access to through super. And this render function needs to be on all of our class components, otherwise we won't be able to update the DOM. If we look back at this, our render function right here is what updates the DOM. So if we want to have something, if we want to write some JSX inside a class component, that always needs to happen inside the render function. Okay, so you can see that our component has been mounted and is displaying to the DOM, and the constructor was called, and super was called, giving us access to lifecycle methods, and then render was called, which in turn put this H2 header rendered this H2 header onto the DOM. Okay, so take a deep breath. And I just want you to focus on this part here, okay? Yeah. Okay, now that we've got kind of the syntax down and we've talked a little bit about what lifecycle hooks are, I want to talk about one more thing that Super gives us access to, and that is, let's see. So yeah, so Clint asks, does line 19 do the actual render? Yes, this does the actual rendering. This does the rendering to the virtual DOM, but we kind of leave the virtual DOM out of when we're talking about React and about components. We just say that this part will be rendered through the render function. So technically, the process is a lot more complicated than that, and react.dom.render is doing the actual rendering to the DOM, and this render is doing the render to the virtual DOM. But you'll rarely hear people kind of talk that way. You won't hear people say, "Yep, this is going to be rendered to the virtual DOM," and kind of leave it at that. So we talk about this as just rendering to the DOM. But good point, Clint. Thanks for clearing that up. Okay. Inside our constructor, we have access now to, we can build an object called state that is going to take care of, is going to manage the data for this component. We talked about this quite a bit yesterday. So now we actually get to use the state object itself. And it's very simple. So we're going to, good, Sasha, I'm glad that was helpful. So we're going to look at this object. Now, it's important to realize what's happening with the this keyword. The this keyword is going to let us build this state object as a property on our class. Okay, so doing this inside our constructor actually creates state as a property on our class that we can call, that we can access via this.state inside our render function, or inside other properties if we had another property out here. Okay, so doing this gives us access to this data object. So so now we're going to build out some data, and I've got some data. Let's start simple. Let's create a message prop on our state object. And let's make this a string that says world, exclamation point. Now we're going to come down to our JSX, and we're going to use interpolation to access this state and print and render it to the DOM. So instead of just typing everything out here, we're going to make this a tiny bit more dynamic by using our interpolators here, and we're going to say this.state.message. And when we do that, then in our JSX, it will grab this.state.message, and it will print out world right here. Okay, now tell me why we have 2 exclamation points. I really appreciate that you guys are interacting with me a little bit more with these emojis. That's awesome. Joseph says line 18. So line 18, one is in the state and the other is in the H2 tag. Perfect. So line 18 has an exclamation point, and our state string has an exclamation point. I did that so we can start kind of keeping track in our mind of this idea that this is still text that's going to be printed and rendered outside of our curly braces here. Cool. Very important. Yeah. There's one. Good, good, good. In the render. So Patrick, that's a good point. Patrick brings up a good point that at some point we want to avoid having any text in the render property. I can see where you're coming from, and I'm going to disagree just on the fact that there's quite a few cases that you'll have text that doesn't need to live inside your state. That's not necessarily data. And that isn't used other places. So yeah, so sometimes we're going to have static text that will live here. For example, and I'll give you a quick example here. Looking back at this class that you built a couple weeks ago with Josh, there you were console logging this.speak and I am a child object. So this would be static text, and depending on how we instantiated this child, how we instantiate that will give us a different string here. So this part's dynamic, and then the rest of this sentence is going to be static. It might be easier to look at right here. So inside this class, this.speak is, we were just looking at that. So here we go. Class person. Return, hello, my name is, and then the name is dynamic. So this is an instance that we have some static text and some dynamic text. Okay. So essentially what's happening in render is that render is going to update the virtual DOM every time new dynamic. Yes! Boom. Patrick, thank you. 100 points to your Gryffindor house of choice. So this is wonderful. Essentially what's happening in render is that the return is going to render some JSX to the virtual DOM every time new data is passed to it. So if we somehow update this message, the value of this.state.message, it'll run this render again. And we say it'll re-render this component. So yes, awesome. And that's why this render lifecycle hook extends over both the mounting phase, because it gets called when it first mounts, and over the updating phase. So as we update our state, it'll get called over and over again. So that's why that stretches far across there. Okay, awesome. Woo! So let's see. Michelle says, could we also have used hello this.state.message? So yeah, that's a good question. So she's saying, can we do this? But let's watch what happens when we do this. Is it's actually going to print out that $sign. The reason for that is we're not inside backtick tags like this. So the $sign curly brace only works inside backticks. So this is an interpolated string. This syntax is called interpolation as well, because it's going to interpolate some data inside of it and print out that text. And these do the same thing. These interpolate some data inside it and print out that text. So what we could do is we could wrap this entire thing in curly braces and which means that we're expecting some JavaScript something to happen inside these curly braces, which we could do backticks. So then, if we do $ here, then we can use backticks and we can use the $ curly braces. But since we have the syntax that we can use the curly braces without doing the setup, we'll keep it a little bit more simple and a little bit more intuitive as to what's happening right here. I'll comment this out. Ooh, comments in JSX I never remember how to do comments in JSX. So this would work. Oh, that'll work. Okay, good. So I'll leave this here so you guys can see the example of what we're talking about there. Okay, so cool. Does that, yeah. So everybody's kind of talking about the backticks. Does that help you understand that, Michelle? I'll let you answer there. Okay. So question, they are interchangeable if we have the backticks. Yeah, so this is how you do it with the backticks. This is how you do it without. Oh, you typed in the back. Okay, cool. Yep. Usually there's some good use cases for backticks inside JSX where we're just printing out the simple string. Then we're okay without it for this instance. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want you to open up a new code sandbox, and I want you can reference what's on my screen here, and I want you to build a class component, and this class component is going to print some message that you have on state. So you can be a little creative with this. You can just call it message. You can do a name here and give someone's name and then a hello message to that person. However you want to set that up. The important part is that we set up a class component. We have a constructor that's calling super, and then inside our constructor, we're calling this dot state and creating some state data. And then inside our render, we're going to return. So take about 6-7 minutes. I'll run a timer over off to the side and build that so you know when we're going to come back. Oh, let's see. JSX comment. Yes, thank you. What are we building? So basically you're building out this React component. I just wanted to get your fingers used to the syntax, your fingers and your eyes used to the syntax. So essentially building this out with this as a reference. And then it's basically a class component that renders some message from your state. Yeah, I'll share this right now with you. Okay, and then I'll have a timer over to the side here. That'll be for about 6 or 7 minutes. Okay, come on back. So hopefully this worked for you, and you were able to build this class component with some state data and the render function, and we're able to render a message from this dot state. So one of the this is really good, and this is getting us to a point that we want to be at, but we're not very dynamic again. So we've kind of taken a step back to learn about this method, but we're not quite there yet. So let's do a couple things to get us back to that point that we were so excited about yesterday. And one thing we're going to do is break this out into another component. So feel free to follow along with me, but we're going to create a new directory. Actually, we can go into source and create a new directory called components. And then inside this directory, we are going to create a file called message.js. Now this, we're going to build a component here that's going to be a message component, and it's going to be in charge of rendering this message here. So we're going to import React from React. And this is going to be a functional component because it's not going to have state on it. And we won't need access to any of the other lifecycle methods. So inside message.js, we're going to create a function here, and we know we're going to pass some kind of message down to it. So let's bring in our prompts like this. Patrick says, I'm wondering how we can make this component so dry that they can read things into it rather than having to be having it be like this. Yeah, we'll definitely get to that point where we are where things are really dry and you're composing a web application with components rather than just repeating code over and over and over again. Good question, Joseph. He says, how should we think about what components should have state and which shouldn't? So let me see if I can find this. Actually, I have it. The diagram we were looking at yesterday is this one. Nope, that's not the one we want. Oh, I didn't save the URL. Okay, so we looked up React component tree. Images. Aha, here we go. So we were looking at this image yesterday. And let's zoom in there. Sorry, it's going to be kind of bad. I'm just going to save this URL. Okay. So the question is, how should we think about what components should have state and which shouldn't? The way that most people have started doing this. So React, again, is very unopinionated and isn't going to tell you which components should have state. It's going to let you decide how to architect that. So you'll notice that down here in the key, it may be hard to see, but this says container and this says presentational. So the purple components are container components. So we have app as a container, main page is a container, and these are containers here. So what a container means is that Usually a container component will have some kind of data that it is in charge of. And most likely will not render anything so slow, anything but child components. Okay, so this app won't have an H2 in it, or it won't have a P tag. It won't have divs. It may have a div because it kind of have to wrap everything around it, around your children components. But a container component is in charge of data and data only. It's in charge of business logic, is what we call this. It's in charge of housing the data. It's in charge of updating the data. And we'll actually see a really good example of this in just a minute here. The container components don't render anything except other children components. So what does that mean for these children components? Well, so that means that this is going to be a class component with state. Okay. So the purple ones are all class components with state. Now we have presentational components, which are all the white ones. And a presentational component is exactly the opposite. No data and can render other stuff. This is going to really come into play. We'll see this today a little bit, but it's really going to come into play later when you have lots of components that you're building into your application. So you'll notice I didn't say that these presentational components can't render child components. As you can see, our table row is rendering child components, but it's also rendering other stuff as well, and it doesn't have data. So our container components in yellow are class components with state. Our red components are functional components with no state. So this is a very typical way to architect a React application. So hopefully that helps, Joseph. So Patrick went on and said, I mean that we have to type message into the constructor. I don't want to have to do that. I want to have something be read into that dynamically, then push the render. Yeah. Yep. All the things. So normally we're not doing something as simple as just, let's erase this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to, give me 1 second. I'm going to save this drawing because there is a save. Okay, perfect. Now I'll clear it out. And okay. I'll post that in the channel later. Okay, so yes, normally we're not going to be, when we have a real live application, like say if we're looking at Facebook, just like Tom said, we would do something like pull in data from a database, from an API, and then when that data comes back from the API, we would add it to the state object, and then that would get rendered in the DOM. there is still a fair amount of static text, guys. So yes, this kind of stuff is really, really cool. And this is the power of React, that we can have all this available to us and make things so dry and so reusable and composable that we're just making life easy for ourselves. But there's going to be a lot of static content. So it's not all going to be interpolation like this. There's going to be a lot of static stuff happening in big applications. Okay, so Brian asks, how often do you use React Fragment in the real world? That's a new thing, and we'll go over it later. Probably not today, but it's being used more and more often. Alejandro says, for presentational components that do not need state, do you recommend using just a functional component? Yes, just functions. So the reason for that is if we're just presenting something to the DOM and we don't need to have our component keep track of anything on state, then why not just make it this simple and easy? This is also a little bit more optimized than all of this, because this is calling the constructor in React.component, and there's a lot more happening here in the background that just takes a little bit more computing power. Also, from the perspective of a developer, if I come in and see this versus a function, then I'm kind of expecting that there's going to be something on state or that we're using the lifecycle methods. And if neither of those things are happening, then I'm going to say, well, I would expect this to be a functional component. So, okay. Some components provide structure and others direct data through that structure. Yes, you guys are getting it. You guys are drinking the Kool-Aid. Oh, yeah. So some components are container components, are doing the business logic. In other words, they direct data back and forth to our other components. And those other components are functional or presentational components, which kind of set up the structure, our HTML structure. They print stuff to the DOM. They're actually rendering things to the DOM other than just children components. Yeah, great. Can you say that where there is data, there is state? Ooh, really good question. So where we are storing data, there is state, yes. But we're about to see how there's going to be data inside this functional component without state, and that is through props. So yeah, I totally know what you're saying there, but I know you understand this, but I don't want you to think about these functional presentational datas or components as not having data, because they do have data accessible through props. So what does stateless refer to? Oh man, you guys are so good. Okay, let me pull this up real quick. State suggests, state suggests data in that moment, but that data will change. Yes, absolutely. Okay. 1 second. Where do I have access to? Let's see. You guys will have to forgive my nephew. He is very loud, if you can hear him. And he hasn't learned yet not to come close to the office and yell. Okay, I was trying to find the image that I saved. So I can't find that right now. So Brian asked, what does stateless refer to? Okay, so we just talked about container components and presentational components. Another name for presentational components is stateless. So that's what that means is we don't have a state object defined inside our component, and so it's probably a functional component. So you'll hear presentational, stateless, and functional components all mean the same thing, but we use those words interchangeably. Okay, state suggests data in that moment, but the data will change. Yeah, so there's two ways we use the word state when we're building React applications. The first is this literal object called this.state in our container components. The second is just more of like this overarching thought of state within our app is kind of the data in our app that we're trying to display to the DOM. So just keep in mind if you hear, because we'll use the same word state talking about both different things, the literal object in our component and then state as the overall data inside our application. Okay, let's see. Data doesn't change. State equals mutatable data holding the current state of the application. And props are immutable data stores for instance data that gets passed once and are constant for that instance. Yes. So what he's saying is, and so in that we're talking about the actual object this.state. And in our functional component, we have props, which are immutable, right? We can't change our props inside this function. Here, this.state, we're going to learn today how to update this object. Now, the idea of the state of our app, the data in our app, we can refer to props object as the state in our application. Okay, let's see. I need to take a deep breath. Okay. State is basically just a property on a classical component that holds data that can be unique to each rendering of the component. Yes, absolutely. Cool, thanks. Yeah, there's state is can mean a lot. Cool. All right, let's move on because we're kind of falling behind. But that's okay. This has been absolutely fantastic. You guys are doing a really good job. Okay, I'm going to, remember we're trying to make this a little bit more reusable. So I'm going to get rid of this and put that inside our message. Okay, perfect. Then instead of calling this.state, we're going to call props.message, which means if we have props.message, well, let's import this into here. And we have our message from components.message or /message. Okay, now we're going to render out our message component right here. And we know it's looking for a prop called message. And so we're going to give it some data through that prop. Non-empty expression. Okay. So that message that we're giving is this.state.message. And now we have a violation. Oh, we didn't export. So we tried to import this and it wasn't getting anything, so it wasn't running anything. Okay, there we go. So now we're using dynamic state data to pass in a dynamic message to our dynamic composable component. Fireworks. Woo, yay. Cool. So this is just the tie-in for what we learned yesterday. Okay, so we can take data that's on our state, pass that through props to a child's component. So let's go a little bit deeper though. Let's take this even further. And remember yesterday how we did not like the syntax where we had our Harry Potter character, our Hogwarts student component being written again and again and again. So we're going to learn today a better way to work with data that looks exactly the same. So I'm going to save this, and you guys have this link. I'm going to start a new sandbox and just use new sandbox. What's happening? Okay, this is a new sandbox with all of this here. Okay, so we have a new sandbox. We're going to rename message in a minute. Let's remove let's put in our state, our data for this is going to be an array of Disney characters. And since we were talking about it earlier, we're going to add Simba. Okay, so we've got a list of Disney characters. If we want to do something like we did kind of did yesterday, and create a Disney character component, then set this up real quick. Whoa, fingers in the wrong row. This is going to take props, and it's going to return something. Okay. So we've got an array, and we want to, in here, we could do something like import our character. Oh, let's do that. Character, Disney character. Sorry, just one more second of setup, and then we'll be ready. Okay, so that's ready to go. So here we could do something like Disney character and pass in a character, right? And we could do like, we could do this dot state dot Disney data at 0. And then we could do the same thing and do at 1. We'll do the same thing and do at 2. But there's a better way to handle this that is drier and better and uses some of our cool JavaScript methods where we can iterate over an array of similar looking data and do this in one swoop rather than all of this, right? So, and especially where this is not dynamic because we're hard coding this part right here, 0, 1, 2. We don't want to do that. What if we don't know how many characters are coming in? What if there's only 2? We would get an error in this line right here. Okay, maybe change Simba to Pete. I know, the crossover, sorry. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to learn how we can iterate over a list of data and generate an array of React components. So let me say that one more time. We're going to iterate over a list of data and generate dynamically a list of React components. Yes, we'll be using map. First, let's do this real quick. So I'm going to delete this because it's going to cause problems, and we'll just return null for now. By the way, this works. You can return null. That's not an issue in React. Okay, so we're not getting anything. That's okay. We don't want anything. We're going to go inside our function here, and above our return, oh, this is a good, something really cool about the render function is above your return, you can do some JavaScript stuff. That will come in handy later. So right now, let's just look at, let's do this in our return. So in JSX, we can return an array of elements. Okay, I'll look at your comments in just a second. Okay, kind of cool. So we don't have to return kind of how we've been doing so far. We can actually return in our JSX an array of elements, of JSX elements. And you can see it's being, it's up here, being rendered out right here. Autocomplete, get the link. Okay, cool. So we can use this with the knowledge we have of JavaScript. And now that we've learned that JSX can accept an array, then we can combine those two things together to do something really cool. So as Brian and Michelle mentioned, we have a JavaScript, we have a function called .map that iterates over an array and returns an array, which is exactly what we want. We want an array for our JSX. So using this knowledge that that .map returns an array and that we want an array, we're going to build out a cool thing here. All right, so let's look at how we can do this. Now, in JSX, if we want to run some JavaScript rather than like build an element, we have to use curly braces, right? First, let's wrap this in a div or else it will complain at us. So we're going to do some JavaScript, which is going to include our .map. So we need our interpolation brackets here. And we're going to say this.state.DisneyData, which is an array. And we're going to map over this array. dot map. So what is this going to do on each iteration? We're going to have, so this is a function, right, that we pass into it. So we're going to have inside our function, we're first going to be passed a character, one character for each iteration, right? So this is looking exactly like our dot maps that we've used so far, right? So dot map is expecting, if we do it on multiple lines, it's expecting a return, right? So we're going to return a JSX element. So we're going to grab our Disney character and we're going to return that JSX element for each of our characters. But it's kind of boring so far because we don't have Disney characters built out yet. So thank you, Megan. Map an LI with character name in it, and it will iterate over all of them. Yes. So a lot of times you'll see, yeah, let's do that real quick. So let's do an LI. So if we make this an unordered list, I will go enable that feature quickly. So we do LI, we can interpolate character.character name. And now we have a list because of this map here. We have a list of character names. Whoop, whoop. Good idea, Brian. I like that a lot. To show that this can happen. But we've got our Disney character component. So let's use our character component. And here we will return, we'll do an H3. And let's pass down our character. So we're going to pass down our full character up here. So this object will be passed to this prop here. We'll rename this so we can see where the correlation is. So character prop comes in to props, and we can call it right here. Then we know that character prop is this character, right? So we're passing down the character that we're iterating over to our character prop. And what is that character that we're iterating over? It's this object one at a time right here. So our character object has a character name property right there. Da 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 da! Woo! So cool. Let's take a look at this under the hood real quick, because this stuff is awesome, right? I love JavaScript. Okay. What did we print out? We printed out a div with a bunch of repeating H3 headers. So that's what actually got rendered to the DOM. So if we open up React, we can see that we've got an app component, which is our container component, wrapping all of our child components. And we can see that we are rendering dynamically this Disney character component, even though, oh, that's not the one. Even though we just have it listed once here. So now we are using dot map to iterate over a list of data. And how did we say it before? Iterating over a list of data and generating an array of React components. So we've generated dynamically an array of Disney characters, and our Disney character is in charge of actually putting stuff onto the DOM here. Okay, I want you to take a couple minutes break before we get into the last part of our lesson. I will share this with you if you'd like to. If you're not understanding what's happening here, I would like you to take this 5-minute break and try and find where each of these is coming from. Props is coming from here. Character prop is coming from here. Character name is coming from this character dot character name. Patrick said, so we use this dot state in our render, but props in our function. Is there a reason for that? Yeah, so we use this dot state dot Disney data because that's where our Disney data array is. So this is the state of our componentry. This is our our app component is the container component, and it's holding our state. And oh yeah, save. Let me share this real quick. This is a new one. Okay, so app is our container component, and it's holding our state, and it's passing it down to one child component through props. And so in our app component, since this is where the data lives, we're going to call, it's on the state object, we're going to use this dot state. And then in our child component, we're passing, this is the child component that we're rendering. We're going to pass down our character data that we're mapping over in a prop, onto the props object. So here, our props object gets passed to our functional component, and it is a object of each time that Disney character is getting rendered, each iteration is being passed a new character object, okay, under the name character prop. So character prop, props.character prop dot character name is what is being listed here. Okay, 5 minutes and we'll be right back. Again, if you didn't quite understand that, go through that code box and code sandbox and see if you can find the connecting pieces. Okay. Cool. Hopefully you guys are doing okay. I'm just going to do a quick poll. In the channel, and we'll do 1 to 5. 1 is you're completely lost. 5 is totally ready to go. We'll make it anonymous. Private comments. So just jump on the main channel right now and add vote on here, so we can kind of get a feel of where you're at and what we need to do for the last part of this lecture. Oh, one is I have no idea what is happening. And that's okay. To be a 1, that's okay. It's going to be important for you to be honest with yourself here, so that you know what you need to do to get up into the 3, 4, 5 area. 3 is we're comfortable with where we're at. Okay, this is really good because this was we kind of moved quickly through some stuff here. So I'm glad that the great majority of the class is in 3, 4, 5 area. If you are a 1 or a 2, if you're feeling at that point now, we're going to get into even more new stuff at this point. Stay with us, get through the lecture, and then reach out to your PM and say, hey, I was one of the 1s, or I was a 2 and I'm pretty lost. I'll talk to the PMs today, and if we want to do maybe today we need to do a slow walkthrough through the project or through some of this material again, and I'm okay to jump online with you guys for an hour or 2 hours and do that with you. So if you're in the 1 or 2 range, just let your PM know. And this is again, it's okay to be there. Just communicate with us so we can get you into the 3, 4, 5 range there. Cool. So we're doing some really cool stuff now. This is starting to feel a lot more like we can build a pretty big, complicated React application. The only piece that we're missing at this point is how to update our data and make our data dynamic. So right now we've got a completely dynamic component. We've got a dynamic container component that is generating an array of functional presentational components based on our data. Now we just need to make our state. This is the only piece left that is hard-coded here, that's static. So let me go out of here, and we're going to create a new React sandbox. And just kidding, we want to kind of want the setup that we have here, but we'll change it up a little bit. Okay. But I want this to be in a different app so you guys can look at it later. All right, so in order to make this more dynamic, we need to, usually this happens, usually state changes based on 2 things. First is kind of what was mentioned earlier, that we can get data from a database, from an API call, and bring it into our React component and put it on our state object. We're going to learn about that in like a week and a half. So that's a long ways away. Don't worry about that. The other way that state data can change is through user interaction. So we're going to build a component that has a list of names. We'll call this list of users. And we're just going to have an empty array right here. Okay, we don't have anything here. We want to create a new directory called components. And our components is going to have a new file called user.js. Actually, we'll go user list.js and another file called user.js. Okay, so this is going to be a functional component. Be wary of copying and pasting in case you forget to change something somewhere. I'm doing it for sake of time here. Okay, so our user list, as the name suggests, is going to be an unordered list. And this unordered list is going to map over, so we're going to do our curly braces. It's going to map over props.users. Okay. We're going to pass in a user on each iteration. And that user is going to be passed down to our user component. So we're going to have user. And our user, it's going to have a prop called user, which is going to take in user. I'm not going to change up the names here because this is very common that you'll have these names being passed over and over again. And I want you to start to see, it's a little confusing at first, knowing what goes where, but I want you to see this kind of syntax, because this is very common that we don't. Last time we did something like that, right? Not going to help you out this time. Okay, cool. Yes, Tom, we will be using set state. Okay, so for this to work, we need a user component, right? And our user component is going to return a li for each user. So we have props.user. Oh, that needs to go. It's like, why did that look funny? Okay, so user is just going to display users, and user list is going to go through our users that it gets from props and map over that list and render out a list of users. Okay, are you following me here? Doing good? All right. So we've got a list of users. We're not going to do this. So again, this is a container component. Usually doesn't handle something like this. Usually we have that list component kind of is in the in between. So we're going to get user list, and it's going to take pass down our user list from this.state.users. What did we call? I think we called this different. So in our user list, we're looking for props.users. So users needs to go there because that will turn into props.users on the user list. Okay, now let's just import everything. Okay, so we've got our user list. Ooh, we've got, see our semicolon right there being printed. There we go. Let's import our user here from our user list. Okay, cool. So now we've got everything up to date there, ready to do this. Here's that for reference. Yes. Cool, cool, cool. This one can have a semicolon at the end because it's after our full expression like that. All right, so what we want to do is to build a list of users, and we're going to do that by creating an input in our app, and then we're going to type into the input and we're going to hit submit. Okay. So in order to do that, we're going to make one more file called userform.js, and in our user form, we're going to have a form with an input inside of it. And then we're going to import this into our, and render it here. Okay, there we go. And we're going to render that here. So as we render user form, it is going to render our form. And then inside our form, we also want a button that says add user. Okay, pretty simple. Let's make sure that our user list is wired up correctly. So let's just add a name here that says Dustin, and one more that says Josh. Cool. So that is working. Now, now we need to be able to go in here, add something to this input, click our button, and have it update our state. So those are the steps. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. To make this happen, we're going to rely a lot on what's called React synthetic events. So in web development, everything we do is based around the DOM. On the DOM, the DOM has built into it an event loop that listens for changes, listens for clicks, listens for some type of event happening in the browser. For example, if I start typing here, these are events that are being fired off and entering that event loop. So in order to access the event loop in React or in the virtual DOM, remember we're building a virtual DOM first, which is then rendering to the actual DOM. So the React team built what's called the synthetic event, which is the virtual DOM's implementation of the real DOM's event loop. So really cool. They realized that by building the virtual DOM, we'd lose access to the real DOM, and we don't want to do that. It would turn into something like our buttons would look something like this. So you'd have your onClick event, and then you'd run get element by ID, and whatever the element is, and then you'd give it the date string, and the button's called what time. So this is what, if we were trying to manipulate the DOM straight from our React form, from our React app, this is what we would do, something like this. But that is an anti-pattern in React, okay? So we don't want to do this. We are getting away from direct DOM manipulation because the whole point of React is to use the virtual DOM. So we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to use the synthetic event and the event handlers that React has built in for us. So instead of doing on click, we're now going to do on click. Woohoo! The biggest difference is that it's capitalized. We're now camel casing our event handlers, right? Vera said, would that be similar to a message queue in this case? Yeah, what's cool with React is because they know they're building a virtual DOM before it ever gets to the real DOM, they can optimize their queues, and they can update what needs to be updated in the virtual DOM in a very smart way. And we don't have like this big, long event stack piling up, or this big, long queue of different events waiting to happen. And so that's one of the reasons that React is so fast and so performant. Okay, so we've camel cased our onClick, and we pass into it a function. Before we were passing in a string, right? So yes, Brian, they do. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. So we pass in this function, okay? And this function is going to take the synthetic event as its argument. So let's just look real quick at what this event is. So we're going to console log our event. I save everything and open up our console and click. You'll see, oh, why did it? Okay, I know why. So you'll see that our console is being cleared, and that's because of this event propagation that's happening. So let's open this up this way, because then it won't clear our event. So what's happening is, on a click event, you remember that the browser refreshes. So a click event is actually happening on the browser and in our React. So we're going to use the onClick handler for our React, but we need to stop the browser's click function from running. So let's open this up right here so we can just see it real quick, and then we'll talk about how to do that. Oh, still won't let us do it. Okay, well, fine. We'll talk about it right now. Okay, so we're going to bring back our curly braces and drop this down. Okay, so the React event that gets passed in has a prevent default on it, like that. And this will stop the this event from propagating up in the browser. So when we have an on click, we're going to almost always do this. Now we can click, and you can see that our browser is not resetting, and we're getting. Don't worry about these warnings. We'll worry about that in a minute. We're now able to console log our event. If we look at that event, it looks a lot like the event that happens inside the browser, right? There's a few differences here, but just want you to be able to see this event that's happening. Cool. So this is what we're going to do on almost all of our buttons. We're going to have an on click. It's going to be past an event. We're going to run event.prevent default, and then we're going to do something with that. So the thing that we want to do is we want to take what is passed to this input, and we want to change our state. We want to add it to this array, right? But we can't do that from inside this this component. So first, let's talk about what we need to do is we need to write a function in our class component that will be in charge of setting our state, and then we'll pass that function down as a prop to our user form. So what that looks like is, and I apologize, there is a lot of content to this lesson, so we will be a little bit into our lunchtime. Okay, so we need to write a function that updates our state, and we're going to pass that function to our user form. So we're going to call this update, or add, we're going to call it add user. This looks funky, but you're able to do this in a class. If we were in here, we'd have to do function add user, right? If we were in a functional component. But since we're in a state component or class component, we can add this function as a property. And it's accessible as this.addUser. So our add user is going to update the user array. So right now, we're going to pass our event to this function, and let's just console log for now in add user. I don't think there's a click in React. You have to use on click. Okay, so now let's take this, and we're going to add a new prop on the user form called add user, and it's just going to be this.add user. It's just a function. Instead of passing down an array or a string, we're just passing down a function. What's really cool about this is very similar to callbacks, is now inside user form, we can invoke add user from user form, and it will invoke this function on this parent component here. So let's go down and let's say we've got props. So instead of doing this whole long function here, remember on click just takes a function, right? We can pass in a function. So let's just pass in props dot add user. And now when we click on it, we will see in add user, but we need to run event dot prevent default. Oh. Now we're console logging. So our button, which is in our child functional component, is invoking a function in our parent component. Mind blown. Whoa. So this is the tie-in piece. This is where this that we looked at, do we still have that? Nope, I've got it in my notes right here. 1 second. Okay, this right here. Our parent is passing down a prop, and our child is emitting an event back up to the parent through that function call. And now we have the true circle of life. Whew. Yeah. It can be done with our true circle of life. No, where are we? There we go. So cool. Okay, we're gonna get to updating the user array in a second. Let's look at what we can do with inputs. So let's add a new property on our state. It's just going to be an empty string. And we need a comma there. So we're going to make this form into what's called a controlled component. There is such a thing called an uncontrolled component. Uncontrolled. We're not going to get into the difference right now. The reason that this is called controlled is this parent component is controlling the value of our input through the state object. So we need to pass this input text down to our child component. So it lives on this dot state, right? Notice the difference here. This dot state is grabbing something from our state object, and this dot add user is grabbing a property from this class component. Okay. So this dot add user instead of this dot state dot add user or something like that. You always have to be careful of where you're grabbing things from when you're passing them down. Okay, now watch what happens. This is going to be crazy. We're going to add a value to our input, which is called props.input text. What is the value of props.input text right now? What is it in our state? Yeah, it's an empty string. So watch this. If I click into our input, the value that we're giving our input is an empty string. And it's not changing as I type. The reason for this is now a controlled input. This is now a controlled component that is controlled by the value on this .state.input text. We're not updating our state on every keystroke yet. And so we haven't written a function to do that. And so it will not, even if I type, I can type all day long. And it's not going to update until we write a function similar to this that will update our state. All right, we're getting really close to being finished here. So bear with me. Let's first write, handle input. Okay, this is going to handle our input, and it's going to take in an event. We don't need to do prevent default because that's more for a button click thing. Let's console log our event dot target right here. Okay, so we're going to pass this down. Let's make this a little bit more readable. By the way, you can see that that this this line of code is getting very long. So what we do to kind of shorten this up is we drop these down on a new line. So every prop that we're going to be passing into user form is going to get dropped down to a new line. And then we have our closing caret here on the same indentation. Now we can easily see, without scrolling way over in our code or without wrapping silly funniness, we can see all the properties we're passing down to user form. So we're going to do handle input equals this dot handle input. Yeah, this is getting crazy in here. Okay, let's go back to our form and look at what handle input is giving us on the event.target. Okay, so on an input now, instead of on click, we're not clicking an input, we're changing the value. So we're going to say on change. We're going to run props.handle input. Okay, so we're not updating state yet. We're just console logging what is our event.target. So you can see that our event.target has a value attribute, right? We're giving it a value attribute. And our event.target is the input, JSX input that's being formed out here, right? So now we've got a value that's attached to this event.target that we're passing in when we type in here. So now let's console log event.target.value, and if I click A, oh, it's console logging it. So we have what I typed, but it's not updating yet. If I type B, C, D, E, F, H, tricked you. So we're getting the value here, which is exactly what we want, because we want where our state is, we want what we typed, we want the value of what we typed. So can we add value to our form? We can. Our value is coming from props.input text, right? Input text is coming from this .state.input text. So the magic right here. We're going to set our state with our new value. This is a function that is available to us by calling super. Okay, so every class component has this .setState available to it. This gets passed an object, and in our object, we're going to tell our component which value on state we want to update. So we're going to update our input text with event.target.value. Now this will, every time I click on every single keystroke from this input, this function is going to fire and run. And every time this function fires and runs, it's going to add the key that I click, the value of that I'm typing in here, and it's going to set our state with the value that's coming from our input. So now watch this. I'm going to click A. Oh, there's one thing we didn't do. One thing we need to change. That is, nope, not that. So the error, you'll see this all the time. The error is cannot read property set state of undefined. What does that mean? It means that this is undefined. So there's one easy way to bind this to this function. There's also a hard way to bind it and a very verbose way, but this is the easiest way now to bind this to this function right here. So if you write it this way, you won't run into that error ever again. So now, drum roll, A, B, C, D. Woo! We're now updating the state and of our input text, passing that down to our user form, and that user form is putting the value of that state string into the input. Okay, we're close. We're close. This is going to get even more exciting. Let's first look right here. We're going to go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And we're going to inspect this. And we're going to look at our React tools and watch this. This is going to be, let's zoom out just, there we go. So now I've got it side by side. Okay, so in our app, you can see that our input text is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Watch as I type the next one. Ooh, it updated. So with each keystroke, we are updating the state of our app component, okay? Delete that. And you can see here that our user form, which has input text prop, is then being updated with that new state that's right there. So this is a very easy way to kind of visualize everything that's happening. Oh. Cool. Okay, now, last part of this. Let's wire up this button. Let's finish the magic. All right. We need to update our user array. So we have prevented default. We're going to type in someone's name, and we want to add that to our array right here, right? We don't, where is this string Dustin being stored? Where is this string living right now? Yes, this .state.input text. So we can reference, we don't have to do anything like this where we're getting the event target value. We don't have to do anything like this on our button click. All we have to do is reference this .state.input text and push it to our new array, but we're not going to push because that's immutable, or that's mutable. We're going to do a different, cooler way. So we need to add this .state.input text to here. So shouldn't input text event target value replace the value in the form with just that one input? Oh, good question. So why can we write a full string instead of me pushing A here and having the entire thing updated? That's because event.target.value looks at, okay, let's do this. No, we're way past time, but this is important. So let's go to our console. So event.target.value is A. If I type B, it's now AB. So it concatenates the string together. So if I type C, I don't just get C by itself, I get ABC altogether. So it's not just, it doesn't just pass the one keystroke that you typed, it passes the full value plus that keystroke. Cool. All right. So we don't have to do this kind of stuff here for our button. What we're going to do is run this .set state because we want to update our state. We want to update users. So we're going to pass in users here. We know that users is an array. So we're going to make a new array because this is immutable. And we're going to do this cool little trick. Okay, we're going to go ... this .state .users. This is called the spread operator, and we'll go more into what this is later. But this basically is copying this array and adding it into here. So we have every element in, so if we had like 3 names inside our user array, all 3 of those names would be added to this here, to this new array. Then, so we're going to spread in our old array, and at the end of it, after everything that's been spread in, we're going to pass in this .state .input text. So now we've created a new array that we're updating state with by passing in, spreading in our old state, or all of our old users with our new user that we typed in. Oh, same problem here. So we just go equals that, save that. Oh, click. Woo! Woo! Yeah. Okay, questions are coming up. Why not push? Because we want to, this is immutable. It won't let us push. React actually won't let us do a push. We have to create a new array. So we could do this. This syntax here is a shortcut for doing something like mapping over, iterating over every single person we have in the array, and returning that without doing anything. So this line of code will basically create a new array with everything that was in the old array. So we're creating a brand new array with everything that was in the old array, and then well, this would be kind of funny because it would be an array inside an array. But the point of the spread operator is to just iterate and add one at a time everything that's in here into this array. Okay, yes, I will save. Okay, let's see. That's how it adds it to this. Yep. So we're making a new array and we're adding our new user, which we typed in, to the back of the list. So this will bring in everything from the old list. This will add it to the back of the list. Now, one more thing, you guys saw that this is kind of annoying that we click here and the text is still there. So pro tip, just set your state of your input text to an empty string. Now as I click, it will add my user and it will clear out my input. Boom. Okay. That was a lot. Any last questions before I show you the homework for today? If you click the button with the empty string, will it add an li? Oh yeah, good point. It will. So you can write some JavaScript in here that says like, if this dot state dot input text. Oh. So an empty string is falsy, right? So we can just do that. If it's falsy, then, or if it's not falsy, if you have something in the string, then update your state. Good point. Thanks for bringing it up. That was really good insight in how that would work. Can you explain what prevent default does? Yep. So the prevent default, if I don't have this, then the browser still registers our click event, and by default, which we're trying to prevent, by default the browser will refresh and we'll lose our state. Our state will refresh back to this empty array, empty string. So if I type in Dustin, then the whole thing refreshes. Just so. So we need to do this to stop the browser from doing its normal event thing, because we're going to do, we're going to use React's event. So now with prevent default, it prevents that default browser behavior and the page doesn't refresh. Okay, any other questions? Oh, good question. So why does the empty string clear input text while each input appends? Because we are using this .set state to set the state of both properties. So first we're going to add our new user, and then we're going to change it to a string. And React knows that this is the pattern, so it knows not to reset our input text until it's added this to our user. Yeah, I'm assuming eventually we will learn how to keep it even if it refreshes. Yeah, we actually don't teach a lot of that here, but you can use things like local storage, or there's some caching. You can cache this data somehow. Yeah, it is a tough situation. Let's see. There's things you have to do. You have to be really smart in how you handle this. Every time the page refreshes, you want to be able to go back, or you will go back to this empty state. So you kind of have to decide, will I have data here that I need to save? If I do, then I set it to local storage, and then I run a this.set state when the component is mounting, or when it's mounted. But yeah, that's going to be confusing. So there are ways to do it. 10 points for your Gryffindor, or for your Gryffindor house of choice, for your Hogwarts house of choice, for seeing that that could be a problem. Okay, let's look at the project for today. So the project is this React to do project, and this is going to be, you're going to work on the first part today, and then you're going to keep working on this same project tomorrow. So you have day 1 challenges, and then you have day 2 challenges. So your stretch for today, these bullet points are your MVP for today. Your stretch for today is tomorrow's stuff, and then your stretch after that are these stretch problems. And then your stretch after that is in training kit, you have today's project and tomorrow's project, but then you have an extra stretch assignment, the React sorting hat. This is actually pretty cool if you get to this point, going along with our Hogwarts theme. So finish today and tomorrow and the stretch problems. If you finish all of that before end of day tomorrow, jump into React sorting hat. So today, you will be creating a to-do list. So you'll have an input, you'll have a button that will add your new typed out to-do in your to-do list. You'll have a clear completed button that will, so you'll see in a second, you'll be able to click on your to-do list items to complete them. And then if you were to click clear completed, it would clear those out of your list. So this is all the, if you get your app looking like this and have this functionality that you see here, this is the MVP. There's some instructions to initialize. We're not going into separate folders, so this is the root of your project. This is where you're going to run yarn install. Michelle, this is today's MVP. Today's MVP. You know enough now to accomplish this today. Oh, let's see. This is saying gift for what, or the course of 2 days. So let's look at today's MVP. Oh, yeah. So tomorrow you'll be clicking and setting that to completed. I apologize. I lied to you. So today we want to be able to render our list and use this input to add new to-dos. And then let's see if there's anything beyond that. I think that's going to be it. So your app component, just like in today's lesson, is your container component. It will hold all the data. It will house all of your handler functions, just like we did today in our user list. Then you'll have a to-do list, which will be similar to your user list. You'll have a to-do, which will be similar to the user, and then to-do form, which will be similar to our user form. So you should be able to get through this by today. And then jump into tomorrow, which will be toggling to-do's completed flag from false to true, and the clear completed button. Okay, so your data is going to look like this. This is what you want, what your state should look like. This.state.tasks or this.state.todos should look like this. They're going to be objects with a task, an ID, and whether it's completed. Task field is the to-do title. The completed field should default to false, and then we'll worry tomorrow about toggling that to true. And then the ID field is a unique timestamp that will be assigned by date.now. Okay. All right. That is it for today. I know that was a lot. We kind of got carried away on some of our questions and did a deep dive on a few things. And that's really good. I'm glad you guys are asking those questions. There was definitely a lot of content to get through today. So please reach out if you are stuck on anything. And if you were in a 1 or 2, if you feel like you're 1 or 2 with this content, let your PMs know so they can communicate to me and we can make sure that you get caught up on all of this content. So good luck. Have a great lunch. You can go into your project time. I give you permission to take a good time for lunch, and no more than an hour. Shorter if you can handle it, but take time to rest your brain before you jump back into this. Thanks, guys.